early investigations of occupational health, occupational disease among miners, specifically black lung. Passage of the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act in December of 1969 marked, or may have marked, perhaps I should say, the beginning of a new era in relations between the federal government and private enterprise. This landmark legislation not only established a mandatory health and safety code for a major American industry, but it also provided unprecedented federal workmen's compensation benefits to victims of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, or as it's more commonly referred to, black lung. And by so doing, the federal government formally recognized this respiratory affliction as an occupational disease, and finally took a public stand in what was a long, bitter conflict among medical, industrial, political, and labor elites over the health hazards of coal mining. And I should go a little bit into black lung, although many of you may be familiar with it at various levels. Coal workers' pneumoconiosis is a respiratory disease caused by the prolonged inhalation of coal dust. This dust, of course, is an inevitable byproduct of the mining process. It certainly has been present even before the mines were mechanized, but even more so as mechanized mining, as technology of mechanized mining has progressed. It's thrown into the air at the working faces of coal seams, primarily by blasting, by the high-speed cutting bars of mining machines, and by loading operations. This coal dust remains suspended in the air for long periods of time and is carried throughout the mine by ventilating currents. The exact pathology of coal workers' pneumoconiosis is still, even today, disputed. The medical authorities generally agree that microscopic particles of coal dust pass through the protective devices of the nasal and bronchial passages and are deposited in the lungs, giving them the appearance that prompted miners to coin the term black lung. This coal dust prevents the passage of oxygen into the bloodstream, causing the miner to be short of breath and reducing his ability to perform the physical labor upon which he depends for his livelihood. The disease is progressive and can result in total disability and ultimately death for miners who continue to be exposed to coal dust. Black lung is only one of a group of dust-related respiratory diseases, usually occupationally linked, called pneumoconiosis. For years, the most famous disease of this group was silicosis, a disease which afflicted hard rock miners, workers in metal mines, tunneling operations, and in some surface industries. Some authorities contend that concern about the health hazards of coal dust has been overshadowed by a preoccupation with silica as the sole etiological agent in pneumoconiosis. According to traditional accounts, which are generally accepted, even though the etiology of black lung, or even its existence as a disease with occupational links, is in dispute to this day. Historians and medical authorities generally agree on one thing, and that was that black lung was not identified as a specific disease entity with occupational origins until 1942, when British scientists definitively established its etiology. Medical authorities generally discount American activity in this area, and they conclude that Americans were slow to recognize the existence of this disease, and they criticize American investigators for their lack of awareness and lack of concern about the health of coal miners. But upon closer investigation, closer examination, historical evidence does not entirely support such harsh judgments. American researchers, I submit, were actively involved in studies of coal miners' health in the 1920s and 30s, and they were plainly aware of the potential health hazards of coal dust. However, a number of factors prevented the findings of American authorities from achieving the notoriety of the British results. The most significant among these factors were, first, the orientation, attitudes, and methods of persons involved in American studies of coal mine health and safety, and second, the encumbering relationship between the U.S. Bureau of Mines, which conducted most of the investigations, and the industry it was created to serve. The Act of Congress that established the Bureau of Mines in 1910 is an outstanding example of progressive era reform legislation. As Professor Gravener has so ably pointed out in his book, through empirical research, scientific method, the Bureau was to provide the expertise and long-range guidance that mining industries needed to operate smoothly and efficiently. To be a cooperative relationship with the industries, not an adversary one. Consequently, the Bureau had no regulatory authority, nor even any right of entry into mines throughout most of its history. In order to carry out its mission, the Bureau depended upon the cooperation of the industry. It was forced to cultivate and maintain the goodwill of mine operators. Despite its conciliatory posture through most of its history, the amount of cooperation that mine owners gave the Bureau often depended on the subject of its investigations. When the subject was miners' health and occupational disease, operator enthusiasm diminished considerably. Few mine operators were as openly hostile as one official who blocked Bureau attempts to study dust conditions in his mine in 1919 because of the disruptive effects that the findings might have on his labor force. He said that his company preferred its miners to be, quote, strong in the back and weak in the head. Nor were many company officials as brutally frank as the operator who advised the mine owner that after all, this is quote, after all, operating a coal mine is a business proposition, and that is the basis on which the company must be conducted if you are going to make any money. Bituminous coal mining is a business which should be devoid of all sentiment. Most operators, however, merely responded to Bureau requests for dust studies either with a polite lack of interest or with cooperation on the condition that no clues to the identity of their mines be contained in the results. In fact, this request was so common that it very quickly became a standard Bureau policy and one which retarded the efforts of health and safety reformers to bring unhealthful, hazardous conditions at a particular mine to the attention of its workers, state officials, and to the general public. The Bureau of Mines was so concerned about the operator's cooperation with its studies of miners' diseases that it was timid even in its general reports on health and safety conditions. Dr. Roy Sayers, a public health service physician who for years headed the Bureau's occupational disease investigations, demanded a very conservative tone from his employees. He required that any reports, speeches, or published articles on miners' health be submitted to him, and that they contain only a description of the research methods and actual findings. Stating opinions and drawing conclusions was forbidden because it could, in Dr. Sayers' words, quote, develop a spirit of antagonism. I want to go on with a longer quote from Dr. Sayers. It may be possible to obtain results by causing an operator to fight and then show him the facts, but I have never been able to obtain, nor have I seen others successful in obtaining the best results with the public by this method, nor has it been successful in getting desired action among physicians. Now, Dr. Sayers' policy caused considerable dissension within the Bureau of Mines Health and Safety Division. In fact, one of the Bureau's top health and safety employees, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Harrington, vigorously resisted this policy, believing that it was counterproductive. And although he acceded to Dr. Sayre's demand for changes in a speech on miners' health he was to give to the Denver Medical Society, he complained to Dr. Sayre bitterly about the policy on the memorandum. Quote, "I fully realize the necessity of trying to maintain, as far as can be done, the friendship and cooperation of various persons in connection with our investigations. Nevertheless, I do not think that we will ever get any action that amounts to anything unless we are willing to get out reports which have a certain amount of bite to them. Doing this with the full realization that such reports will at first sight occasion a slight amount of ill feeling. But so long as the statements are based on fact, the ultimate result is that we will at least be able to get action on the part of those affected. And those persons will at least respect us, even if they may look upon us with a certain lack of actual cordiality." However, while Harrington ultimately became the head of the Health and Safety Division, Dr. Sayre ultimately became the director of the Bureau of Mines. And despite the internal dissension caused by his restriction on reports of occupational health investigations, this policy remained in force until after World War II. Although the Bureau thereby was able to maintain a generally cordial, if not totally cooperative relationship with the industry, the net effect was to diminish the value of its research on pneumoconiosis, especially on black lung. Consequently, the Bureau's policy is at least partially responsible for creating the illusion that American investigators were unaware of or unconcerned about the health hazards of coal mining. And following the publication of the 1942 British landmark study, Harrington was able to comment with scant satisfaction, quote, "About 20 to 25 years ago, we conducted a countrywide campaign studying dust and ventilation conditions in the mines of the United States, both coal and non-coal. However, the reports prepared on the various mining regions were not published, due, in my opinion, to a mistaken attitude of those who controlled the Bureau of Mines policies at that time, and now it is too late to publish them." The most significant of the unpublished studies to which Harrington referred was a 1923 investigation of respiratory disease among coal miners in the eastern United States, which I add parenthetically, I found in the course of my research buried in the restricted records of the Bureau of Mines, which I was given access to. Conducted by Dr. Frank Meriwether, who was on loan to the Bureau from the Public Health Service, and J.J. Forbes, a mining engineer, the study was the most exhaustive and comprehensive investigation of respiratory disease among coal miners carried out by the federal government until 1963. And it certainly compares favorably to British activities at the time. It included physical examinations, exercise tests, and x-rays of the subjects. It considered age, occupation in the mines, length of exposure to dust, past medical histories, and mining conditions, and chemical analysis of mine dust in order to rule out silicosis as an explanation for the results. Meriwether and Forbes examined 513 miners, 200 farmers as a control, and tabulated over 44,000 death certificates. They found that in no case did mine dust contain significant amounts of silica. Yet their examinations showed 30% of the men had pneumoconiosis, and another 40% had more fibrosis in their lungs than considered normal for persons working in non-dusty atmospheres. The results of this detailed 1923 investigation, 20 years before the British study, led them to conclude, quote, that coal dust, when breathed in large quantities over a long period of time, will cause pneumoconiosis. And, quote, that fine coal dust is not only an explosion hazard, but also a menace to the health of miners. Yet this study was never published, nor was it ever cited in any Bureau reports, nor listed in any bibliographies the Bureau published on dust or disease. or in a private research. The most specific reference to this report in the entire health and safety files of the Bureau of Mines came in a 1938 letter from Harrington to a coal company executive who requested information on the silica hazard in bituminous coal mine. Harrington's response was to relate the conclusions of, quote, one of the outstanding medical investigators in the United States on dust and health. This man having unquestionably made more physical examinations of miners in the United States, coal as well as metal, than any other person, living or dead. Unfortunately, the report is confidential, and I cannot divulge the name of the author nor other decidedly interesting data contained in the report, except that it was confined entirely to the effect of breathing dust in bituminous coal mines in the United States. The suppression of this important study is at first difficult to understand. Neither Forbes nor Meriwether were medical charlatans. Both men soon gained prestigious reputations in mining circles. Forbes would be instrumental in developing the first federal coal mine safety code in 1946. Meriwether, at the very time he was preparing this report on his coal mine investigations, was directing the most exhaustive study of silicosis in U.S. history. As head of the Pitcher Clinic in Oklahoma, Meriwether examined over 8,000 tri-state lead and zinc miners in the definitive American research on health hazards in metal mining. His data and conclusions became widely cited in publications on silicosis in the 1930s, when the problem gained public attention. Why then were his equally significant contributions about coal miners' health not given similar treatment by the Bureau of Mines? Particularly when so many other investigators were claiming that coal miners were relatively free of respiratory disease, and that dust was a health hazard only in proportion to its silica content. It's ironic, considering the credit traditionally given for recognizing black lung as a disease entity, that British authorities were partly responsible for obscuring the importance of this early American investigation of pneumoconiosis among coal miners. Since Americans at first lacked their own studies, they relied quite heavily on foreign research and frequently cited in their writings. As American investigators began to look for a dust problem in American mines, the most prominent British authorities were asserting that coal dust was not a pathological agent, and that the only health hazard for coal miners was in rock drilling and in rock dusting to prevent explosions. For further evidence, they pointed to the close relationship between silicosis and other respiratory diseases. In particular, metal miners had a much higher incidence of tuberculosis than did coal miners. So the British were able to present a very convincing argument to inexperienced and impressionable American investigators that silica was the serious health hazard, and that silicosis was the only serious occupational disease in the mining industry. At first, the results of American investigations seemed to confirm the British studies. Studies at Joplin, Missouri in 1917 and at Butte, Montana in 1921 uncovered a 50% incidence of silicosis among metal miners and a tuberculosis rate that was up to 10 times the rate in non-mining areas. At the same time, mortality statistics of coal miners showed no significant silicosis problem, and an incidence of tuberculosis generally well below the national average. So it's not surprising that American health authorities by 1920 agreed with their British colleagues that, quote, coal miners show little that is remarkable, say that they have a really low rate of tuberculosis, or, quote, that dust stands as the chief bane of coal mine air, and its varying composition from coal dust to granite dust is in proportion to its danger to health. In light of such overwhelming evidence on both sides of the Atlantic, Bureau of Mines officials likely were not convinced in 1923 by the Forbes and Meriwether study that coal miners did suffer from any significant occupational health hazard other than silicosis. However, the methodology of these early investigations on which they based their doubts were seriously flawed. The influential mortality studies were compiled by examining thousands of death certificates, which frequently had been signed by coal company physicians. This overworked and sometimes undereducated individual often was poorly equipped and kept few records. His patients frequently refused to be examined for fear that if he found some serious illness, he would tell the operator and they would be fired. Burdened by poor records and with a poor knowledge of the deceased's medical history and confronted with medical literature which claimed that no significant pneumoconiosis or other respiratory disease problem existed among coal miners, the company doctor hesitated to list a cause of death that might antagonize his employer. So the theory that coal dust was not a health hazard became self-perpetuating. The other serious flaw in the early mortality studies was statistical. These early studies did not consider the extraordinarily high accidental death rate of coal miners, because other statistics showed that between 26 and 51% of all coal miners died in mine accidents. And when researchers removed all the accidental deaths from the studies and re-examined the data, they discovered a much greater degree of respiratory impairment among coal miners than they previously had suspected. Although such diseases were still much greater among metal miners, the health of coal miners clearly needed re-evaluation. By 1926, Bureau of Mines officials were claiming that tuberculosis among coal miners did pose a public health menace. And by 1934, they were willing to attribute the discovery of this discovery to a new disease, which they labeled anthracosilicosis, or anthracosis. Yet most American authorities described this disease as a form of silicosis modified by coal dust, which occurred only among anthracite miners. They would not accept the possibility that bituminous miners were affected. So in 1923, Forbes Meriwether study remained discredited. Unquestionably, silicosis was the major occupational health concern of American mining and medical authorities before World War II. Silicosis was, after all, much more prevalent in the Earth's silica, was much more prevalent in the Earth's crust than was coal. The incidence of tuberculosis among silicotics was, after all, greater than among coal miners. American pneumoconiosis authorities were, after all, public health officials or insurance company employees, and were quite concerned that if silicosis remained uncontrolled, the health of the general public might be threatened. Finally, the silicosis problem was dramatically thrust into the national spotlight in 1933, when hundreds of workers died while driving a tunnel at Gauley Bridge, West Virginia. No similar tragedy called attention to the health hazards of coal dust, and coal miners continued to die quietly as mine dust accumulated in their lungs. The public health orientation of many American pneumoconiosis authorities was disturbing to a number of researchers in the Health and Safety Division of the Bureau of Mines, who believed that pneumoconiosis was as much an engineering problem as a medical one. But the physicians, led by Dr. Sayers, controlled the Bureau's Health and Safety Division and ultimately the Bureau itself. And they were less convinced that coal dust was a pathological agent. Dr. Meriwether, however, remained convinced of it, and in 1933, as the evidence on the mortality and morbidity of coal miners was being re-evaluated, he reminded Dr. Sayers of his 1923 study, with no substantive results on it. It was indeed unfortunate for Dr. Meriwether and for the reputation of American investigators in general in the worldwide industrial hygiene community that Dr. Sayers was a conservative physician who was slow to recognize that silica was not the only harmful dust produced in the mining process. It's also unfortunate that the Bureau of Mines policies did not and could not permit wider dissemination of information about coal dust studies, as controversial as such information might have been at the time. A greater general awareness of Bureau activities in this area might well have resulted and public and labor pressure might earlier have accomplished some reforms. However, it is a mistake to assume that the Bureau's lack of published literature on this subject means that American investigators were unaware of or unconcerned about the health hazards of coal dust. Although they remained in the minority before World War II, some American authorities, observing the research that produced the famous 1942 British report, could smugly conclude that they were, quote, very pleased to see that our British friends are slowly coming to realize what we have known for some time now, that coal dust can be and is likely to be harmful to health. Yes.
About the following confidentiality that you might hold, have you made any conclusions yourself about why they were able to subdue this report in 23 other than what you've reported to us today?
I think it's, well, as I have perhaps implied in the paper, but I think I can be more specific than that, is I think it's directly due to the influence of Dr. Sayers, who was not himself convinced, who was convinced that silica was the only pathological agent that really worked. He remained, I've gone through his private correspondence, and in the later years of his life, especially as the evidence mounted, his confidence was shaken in the late 40s. But it seems to me it's the conservatism of one position here who was in a position of power in the Bureau of Mines was successful suppressing all evidence that was contrary to his own particular medical thinking.
Is that a problem as much as what you said at the beginning of the paper, that the Bureau of Mines was there to aid and assist the coal industry? And we see really the same parallel. Maybe, Gordon, you're more familiar with these studies in Utah with the effect of radiation. As long as people are the government investigators and scientists are there primarily to advance an industry, it is really contrary to their own positions to bring out things that's going to damage it. It seems to me
that's certainly the
parallels with the test in Utah on soldiers and so forth in the early 50s, and what you've just said today are so striking that the obvious conclusion for me is that that can just not be.
Yeah, well, certainly up to 1941, the Bureau of Mines officials had to and indeed did walk, tread very lightly. But in 1941, they did get legal right of entry into coal mines in the United States. And so after 1941, there perhaps was less reason in terms of the future of their investigations continuing to risk incurring the wrath of the inmates, of course, in charge, and I think good evidence to indicate that the Bureau has always been very cooperative, very friendly with the industry, certainly more so than later. Indeed, in my research has also uncovered that John Lewis, in 1946, the Mine Safety Code was being put together, fought very hard to make the code a health and safety code. There's some controversy among historians as to exactly how concerned or how convinced Lewis himself was about the health hazards of coal dust. Certainly he was concerned enough about to make the attempt in 46 to get dust level standards as they affected respiratory disease, included in the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Code. There was no significant support from the Bureau to find itself out.
Were there any state studies or by state health officials on this problem in the coal mining state?
Not in the early, not certainly before the 50s. I don't think that most of the state agencies didn't have the resources. The Bureau of Mines pretty well seems to control the investigation aspect, certainly in coal mining anyway. Through their various experimentations and so on and so forth, around the country seems to pretty much have an monopoly on large-scale investigations. Coal miners' health.
When you, just a technical question
Yes.
first, and then some comments. When you were early on and then near the end referring to Harrington and people like that's comments on the British studies, did they comment in a public way? Are you getting that from the records? Are you getting that from medical journal articles?
No, I'm getting that from internal memoranda.
Okay.
And
So I wanted to first identify, because I'm unaware that anyone would dare to take the credit you're giving, if you follow me, for the American studies.
Right.
This is like giving someone credit for, like Galileo laying down and dying in front of the Pope. I mean, if you never bring it up and don't risk yourself, then you get none of the credit, you know.
Yeah.
I think your paper is very valuable, first of all, and you'd have to put me, if you people like yourself don't usually find me to footnote me in the group you criticize that have worked the American position, so, you know, at that early part. I think they deserve to be worked over. You know, what you're adding to, as gentle as your whole paper's tone is, an academic, is a condemnatory posture that ought to be publicly condemned. That men who
Relations officer back during the strike in 1902. I don't know if that's why it got into media, but it had a problem in sales of product and brand differentiation, and in a way it met this problem with film strips of this, not only in trying to demonstrate why anthracite should be the best fuel, but the product, or the brand differentiation between them. The first one I originally wanted to show is a longer one. It's a silent one of the first ones put out by the old company, the Lehigh Coal Navigation Company. And this one, I think, is dated in the 1930s by the Delaware Lackawanna Western Company, expounding how coal is prepared and mined and why Delaware Lackawanna Western is the very best anthracite. And I hope you enjoy watching this.
Are you telling us that these are propaganda?
These are propaganda by the company. You will notice by the nice big homes the miners live in. So you get the other side.
Is it just only one family?
That's enough. That was him.
Will contain a section on mining of some length and worth, but then go on to another topic. In this category, I put Jack Conroy's The Disinherited. I don't know if you've ever read it or not. Ruth McKinney's Jake Home, and Tilly Lerner Olson's Yonandio from the 30s. The first half of The Disinherited is about coal mining in Missouri. The second half of it goes on to the railroads and other themes. Jake Home, in its first chapter, deals with coal mining and union organizing near Altoona, Pennsylvania. And then the rest of the book deals with the labor and communist movements throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. In short, the process of locating fiction that deals primarily with coal mining is a long one with many false starts and dead ends. There are, however, some bright spots in the whole picture. So far, I have found that coal mining is a fiction topic in far-flung areas of the world. I've run across a reference to coal mining stories and art by Anikichi Hashimoto, apparently Japanese. I have not, however, been able to find any of these stories in translation, and I have no way of knowing how to get them translated if I did find them. I have found a novel by Harold C. Wells called The Earth Cries Out, and it is about coal mining in Australia. And also a short story by B.L. Combs called Machine Man, which I also believe is about Australian coal mining. And the only way I can tell that is by the terminology they use. It doesn't sound like in American nor English terminology. And from just looking at the way they use the English language, I think it's about Australia. I've located one novel which purports to be about coal mining in New Zealand. It's called The Devil's Half Acre. But I haven't been able to find a copy of the novel, and I think I've searched just about every library in the United States. Now, someplace in the world there is a novel that has this name. It's published in 1899, and apparently it's lost forever, and I don't know if I'll ever find it. probably one of the best collections of short stories, and the only one that I found about coal mining in South America is Baldomero Lillo's, Lillo, The Devil's Pit. The stories seem to take place in the anthracite fields of Chile. And even though it takes place in Chile, and even though, as I suggest, it seems to be anthracite coal, because they mentioned anthracite several times, the stories are very much relevant to, you can almost see a one-to-one relationship among some company stores, one of the stories. And it certainly sounds like a company store that you might find in the United States. I don't think it really makes a lot of difference whether the mining community is in South America or here in the United States. The continent of Europe has produced a number of novels and stories about coal mining. The one problem, though, is finding English translations of them. The best of those that I have found in an English translation come from Russia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and France. The two items from Russia are Vasily Grossman's Kolchugin's Youth, which is really only partially about coal mining and mainly about steel and heavy industry in general. And also the Russian writer Alexander Kuprin, who is quite well known, I found out as I started to dig into him. The short story is called In the Bowels of the Earth, and the story is a fine short story, and it's placed in Siberia. And I really enjoyed it. I think any miner who read it would enjoy it. This guy has a propensity for drinking. He goes to work. He's hungover. And there's a mining accident, and the boy who works with him manages to drag him out, and then this boy becomes a hero. Before that, everyone was making fun of the boy, creating a problem. There's a Greek miner involved in this, and well, in many ways, I think it's an interesting story. Two of the best contributions from Czechoslovakia are Karel Čapek's, or Kopek, however you want to pronounce it, The First Rescue Party, a novel, which is a good story in my opinion, but I also feel, in my opinion, it's a very shaky translation. I wish somebody would retranslate it. I think it would probably run a lot more smoothly than the one I had, the translation I had. And also, and this is something that I'm sure none of your miners would ever be able to understand, and yet he's written about it, and I don't know why, is Franz Kafka. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Franz Kafka, but as I went through his stuff, I found two short stories. Kafka writes in a way that even, I think it takes somebody to write a book about what he said before you understand what the story is about. One of them is a visit to a mine, and it's another short story called The Bucket Rider. The visit to the mine is about a safety inspecting team. And the only source that I can find for why he might have written the story is that he worked in a miner's insurance, national miner's insurance office, more or less. It was a government insurance office in Czechoslovakia and Prague, and had access to records. And apparently, somehow, there's a connection here between the two. The Bucket Rider is about a guy who needs a bucket of coal, and they refuse to give him a bucket of coal. And if you know anything about Kafka, the guy goes riding off in his bucket to Never Never Land, because he never gets his coal. But those two, I'm afraid, the traditional miner would not understand. These are done, as I mentioned, in the normal, unusual Kafka style. Hungary's Ferenc Molnar has a story in translation called Coal Thieves, which emphasizes the value of coal, but it is not about mining, coal mining per se. In the story, what happens is these guys are carrying coal in a cart, and at every tree they throw off a huge lump, which they then eventually go back and retrieve and sell, I guess, on the black market. This takes place someplace in the early part of the 20th century, or later part of the 19th. I've also found an early novel by Amor Jokai, Jokiai, also Hungarian. It's called Black Diamonds, and it was published around 1900. Finally found it in the rare book library, Petit Library at Penn State. The novel, when I looked at, and by the way, when I was doing these, I went through the index and I found this, and it said about wild miners of Bandavar, Hungary, okay? So I thought, wow, this sounds interesting. I got the novel, and you need a magnifying glass to read the print. It's about that thick, and it's really like a 19th century novel. If you know 19th century novels, they should come in 2 or 3 volumes. And it's really kind of about miners, But it has a lot of subplots going through it, like anti-clericalism, the beginning of the stock exchange, the rise of capitalism. There are all these little things going on, and in the meantime, we have this mine explosion. Okay, and this creates. I never did figure out why the miners were said to be the wild miners of Bondivar, because they certainly weren't that from reading the novel that I got. And as I said, it takes place in the latter half of the 19th century, really in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Although the novel is written in a relatively complex mode for the 20th century reader, it does hold the reader's attention. Franz has, through the authorship of Emile Zola, I think, produced a classic about 19th century coal mining. The name of the novel, of course, is Germinal. It is done in a naturalistic mode, which means you get all the blood, guts, and sex. Okay? And is, in my opinion, one of the best of the continental novels on coal mining. As a matter of fact, I tried it using it in class, and these were mining students, and they didn't want to read this, of course. And then after they got through the first few chapters, and they got all the gore and all the sex, and it's very explicit, they said, wow, this is a great book, and they read it. And I kept saying, should I use it again? He said, yeah, it's a good book. Just warn them, they got to get through the first part. And it has become a relatively big hit with most of the students. And as I said, I think it's one of the best of the continental novels on coal mining. I found a short story about Polish coal miners written by Kazimierz Mclaughlin. It's called The Pit. It's translated by an Irene Morska. In the same volume, translated by Morska, there are two other pieces. One called The General by Isidore Ray, and the other Our Fathers and We, Three Generations by an Ed Falkowski. The first of the two, The General, is about a Polish miner who returns in triumph to his village in Poland after making his fortune in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I don't know what kind of a fortune it was, but he's all dressed up in his uniform. He had an army uniform, and they had a big parade for it. And the second concerns itself with the Americanization of a Polish peasant's family and their introduction to coal mining in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. That's the one, Our Fathers and We. There is perhaps one other novel that should be mentioned, and that is Nikos Kazantzakis' Zorba the Greek, which most people wouldn't think of, and it only indirectly is related to coal mining in Greece. Basically, it's a story of a free-spirited Greek who sometimes makes his living as a coal miner. Most of the coal mining fiction from Europe and in English comes, of course, from Great Britain, particularly England, Scotland, Wales. I am not even going to try to list all of them, but rather I would try to give the names of those that I consider to be among the best. I thoroughly enjoyed A.J. Cronin's The Stars Look Down. In my opinion, it is one of the best of the English coal mining novels. It deals with the English mining and union movement, the nationalization of the mines and the union movement. And I found it to be it's easy to read, it's interesting, and I think it's well written. The Earth Beneath by Harold Heslop and The Odor of Chrysanthemums by D.H. Lawrence are also among the better pieces of fiction about English coal mining and coal mining life. I particularly like The Odor of Chrysanthemums because it's about the wife of an English coal miner, basically, and her relationship to life as lived in a coal mining town in England, and with a drunken husband, by the way. Okay. D.H. Lawrence fans might also like The Sick Collier. This has certain psychological overtones and undertones, as much of D.H. Lawrence's stuff does. And then I read something that it's not fiction, I'm sure of that, but the guy wrote it now let's say he lived it and then wrote it without using the real names. Clancy Siegel has written a relatively modern and negative prose piece about the English miners. I'm not sure that it qualifies as fiction, but the name of the book is Weekend in Dinlock. The best of the fiction written about mining in Scotland, in my opinion, is it came out in paperback, and I picked it up at the beach one year and read it and really enjoyed it. And it was Robert Crichton's The Camerons. And I found that to be thoroughly enjoyable. You can get it in paperback, and it talks about a combination Scotch-Welsh family who make their living in mining and eventually migrate to the United States, to Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact. Tom Hanlon's The Miracle at Cardenry is also good. However, it's a little melodramatic. It's about an explosion and a miracle and apparitions and all sorts of things, but it does hold your interest. And John Cockburn's The Dark Places, and if what he says in that short story is true, we're all a little naive. He has these people working in the pits in Scotland, I think it is, where serfdom is really it. You have collars. Okay, the collars are attached, never removed. And the people are attached to the mine. And the women work in the mine, of course, just as well as the men. As a matter of fact, the women are I would call them the draft animals. They do the hauling. And this one starts with the woman having her child in the mine, and then being kicked because she's not fast enough getting back to work. And if this is true, if any of this is true, if there's any truth to it at all, it certainly is an eye-opener. Although some will disagree, I would include Richard Llewellyn's How Green Was My Valley, which I think has become a classic, probably because of Walter Pidgeon and Maureen O'Hara, but it's not a bad book. And Jack Griffith's The Black Goddess, if you go for mystery stories and evil spells, a fiction short story about coal mining in Wales and Wilkes-Barre area. Conrad Richter is a simple, honorable man. Albert Idell's Stephen Hayne, and perhaps one of the oldest, William Gibbons, those Black Diamond Men, A Tale of the Anthrax Valley, 1902. On the other side of the United States, in the far west, out in your way, there isn't an awful lot, but I did find a few things. I found a few pieces of fiction that deal with coal mining and coal mining life. Marie Che tells the story of life among Italian immigrants who went to work in the coal mines of Colorado in Pilgrim's Pride. And there really isn't a lot about mining, it's a lot about home life of the miners, the immigrant miners. And it's a thoroughly enjoyable book. I chuckled all the way through it. When you talk about it, the preparing of the lamb at Easter and all the trouble they had to get that darn lamb there. And they go through all of their customs, trying to transplant Italy into the middle of Colorado, and it's kind of an interesting story. I also found Upton Sinclair's, of course, King Coal. I think most of you are probably familiar with that, which takes place in Colorado during the mine strikes and the wars there. And Tilly Lerner Olson's Yanadilla from the 30s, which devotes the first two chapters to a child's perception of mining life in the coal fields of Wyoming. For a long time, I was never sure which Wyoming, because the first time I read it was in a short story, and I thought Wyoming. But I was never sure whether it was a state, or whether it was Wyoming County in Pennsylvania, or I think a Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania, or a Wyoming County in West Virginia. I think there is a Wyoming County there. And then finally, when I got a hold of the novel, because later she took the short story apparently and got married, and after she was married took the short story and translated it into a full-length novel. And I got the feeling as I read the novel that they were living in Wyoming, the state, and then moving eastward again back to the cities to find work because life was relatively gruesome as she pictures it. These two chapters in Yanadillo appeared earlier as a short story called Iron Throat under the name of Tilly Lerner. Perhaps the best novel that I've read about mining in the late 19th century in the Midwest is Tom Tippett's Horseshoe Bottoms. Bobby Herndon was the one that put me onto this one. It takes place in Illinois. Also, Joseph Husband has written a prose piece. It's not exactly fiction, but I would include it as creative writing. It's called A Year in a Coal Mine, which takes place in Illinois and provides interesting insights into traditional mining techniques. Finally, Jack Conroy's The Disinherited, which I mentioned earlier, does provide an interesting picture of coal mining in Missouri. In the United States, the bituminous coal fields of the Appalachians have perhaps received the most attention in coal mining fiction. One of the better-known novels about coal mining in Kentucky is James Still's River of Earth. Among the more recent novels about Kentucky and coal mining life is James Sherburne's Stand Like Men, a novel, a violent story of unionizing attempts in Kentucky in the 1930s involving the UMW and the National Miners Union. Kentucky is also the primary locale of James Lee Burke's To the Bright and Shining Sun. It recounts the story of poverty, struggle, and violence, the attempt of one young man by the name of Perry Woodson to break the cycle in which he is trapped. It is, in my opinion, a pessimistic and negative book, and yet, I suppose, I found it easy to read. John Rolfe Gardner's Great Dream from Heaven was an eye-opener to me also, because I'm coming at mining from the fiction point of view, And in this one, he deals with coal mining in Tennessee and details the conflict over the use of convict labor in the Tennessee mines between approximately 1889 and 1900. And I hadn't realized that convict labor had played a part until I was reading this. And it's a relatively gruesome story also. In some ways, it is the story of a Knights of Labor union organizer, Eugene Daniels, who attempts to end the convict labor and organize the free miners. He is finally driven out of Anderson County, which is where it takes place in Tennessee. And the book ends with the Fratterville mine disaster, and when 186 men died, and the return of the unsuccessful organizers who helped in the rescue operations. Among the fiction about southern and eastern Ohio that I found, Rollo Walter Brown's The Firemakers, a novel of environment, Francis Wallace's Explosion, and that's why I was asking you about the word seldom seen. I'm almost positive that the locale in which this takes place is called Seldom Seen, and it's about a mine explosion, and it takes place in the 40s. That's why I was wondering. So I have no way of knowing if it's an actual occurrence or whether it's just something that the writer made up. There's also Owen Glen by Ben Ames Williams, which I found. One of the best written of the modern novels about coal mining, in my opinion, is Howard Fast's Power. I enjoyed that one no end, and it talks about union movement, and you can see John L. Lewis written all over it, although it's never called John L. Lewis. And you can see the UMW movement, particularly in the states of Illinois, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. It kind of spans all of that. One of the newest novels about mining in West Virginia is written by a woman, Barbara Angle. It's called Rinker. She's one of the new women miners, and she's written a story devoted to her experiences and the experience of the people she worked with. One of the best pieces of children's mining fiction that I've read is Elvena Sekar's Zuzka of the Burning Hills, which is also about West Virginia, but told from an immigrant child's point of view as living in West Virginia when her father works in the mines. Charlton Ogburn has treated West Virginia and its strip mines in Wine Spring Mountain, but I didn't find that to be one of the best novels. In western Pennsylvania, there have also been a number of things written. Second half of Conrad Richter's A Simple Honorable Man deals with the coal fields of Cambria and Somerset counties. Chapter 1 of Ruth McKinney's Jake Home takes place in Altoona, as well as Alfred Swift, I'm Going Home. This short story is the only one that I found that deals with the phenomena that occurred in that part of the country in the 1950s. No one else has really dealt with it. He's the first one. And that was the coming of mechanization and the absolute destruction of a way of life in southwestern and western Pennsylvania. He details what happens, the uprooting of the people. You know, today we worry about the massive unemployment in the automotive industry, and yet in the 1950s, with the coming of mechanization, an entire culture was uprooted in many, many places. I was telling someone at one time, Fayette County in southwestern Pennsylvania had over 210,000 people. Today we have 154,000, and that's an increase over what we had. So we lost 50, 60,000 people within about 10 to 20 years, and most of them went to Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and some went to the East Coast, to Baltimore, Philadelphia, various other places. But the mining industry just collapsed. And there was no government program, there was nothing to save us, and the unemployment rate, and I remember because I was in school when my father was unemployed, was something like 25%. And there was nothing to help you. And this is the only short story that I found that even begins to deal with this. Other pieces of fiction dealing with western, and particularly with southwestern Pennsylvania, are Oliver Lawrence's Beyond the Boundary Wall, which deals with a man who refuses to go in to take care of drilling through. He sees water seeping. They're trying to drill through to another part of the mine, and he is asked to open this part of the mine. He sees the water seeping, and he feels it's going to be a flood when they go through, and he refuses to do it, and then he's called a coward. It turns out in the end that there was no flood, okay? But he thought there would be. He refused to do it, and everybody has thumbs down on the man. There is Agnes Sly Turnbull's Remember the End, and John Bergen's Long Discovery, which in my opinion best describes southwestern Pennsylvania culture in terms of the immigrant and the Native American culture and the way they mix together in the mining communities. And then there is, of course, Michael Mismana's Black Fury, which was immortalized in a black and white film, which really distorts the whole novel. There's one chapter in Black Fury, The Young Violinist, which I think is superb. There are a lot of weak places, but The Young Violinist is a story of a young boy who goes into he wants to be a violinist. And there's no way that he can do this. He is sent into the mines at the age of 12 or whatever and has an accident which destroys his hand. And at that point, he's finished. But the story, I think, is quite well written. Now, whether the story, and I'm going to take you now from this survey to something that bothers me as I read this. And I have no answer for it. And it's a question that's bothered me, and I don't know what the answer is yet. Whether the story, the novel, or prose piece about coal mining and life in coal mining communities comes from Chile, Australia, continental Europe, Great Britain, the eastern, western, or mid-American coal fields, there is a sameness about them. I do not mean that the stories are exactly alike, or that the manners and speech of the people are the same, or that there are not peculiarities related to the place, time, or nationality. What I do mean is that miners and those living in mining life, as portrayed in the fiction, seem to share certain likenesses. There are common themes running through much of the fiction, as long as the mining portrayed is of a traditional or pre-mechanized type. Incidentally, I have found very few pieces of literature that deal with mechanized mining. Three of them that kind of touch on it: Machine Man, To the Bright and Shining Sun, and I'm Going Home. I have found very few that deal with this, and the ones that deal with the traditional have the same themes. Okay, for example, in most of the fiction that I have read so far, I readily admit that I've only read part of it. I haven't read all of it. These themes seem to occur over and over. Number one, the fiction usually discusses the deprivations or hardships of mining and mining life. That's one of the things that you can't miss. Two, that quite often depicts you can almost predict that someplace in that novel or that short story there will be a disaster. Whether that disaster is a mine gas, explosion type thing, a mine fire, a mine flood, or a roof fall, it doesn't matter. There will be some sort of a disaster. Thirdly, there is usually a conflict within the novel or the short story, and that conflict is almost always between the company or the mine owner and the mine owners, or it might be related to the unionizing efforts going on among the mine workers. It seems to come up over and over. Sometimes it could be just miners against company over working, no union involved. At other times, it's the miners trying to unionize and running contrary to the company's wishes. Fourth, usually there will be a strike. Some of them are violent and some of them not. And usually, when there is a violent strike, there will also usually be a violent attack upon some physical representation of the company or the oppressor. And that thing that most often gets attacked is the company store. 5, usually they portray the attitudes of acceptance and strength of the women of a mining culture. The women of the mining culture are usually portrayed, from what I can see, as accepting and very strong. 6, the fiction usually suggests or describes even the distortion of the lives of the children. The fact that their lives are distorted, and quite often it turns out that the only way they can get out of all this is to be educated. Education is the answer. That's the only way. And 7, quite often the fiction notes the development or existence of strong bonds of brotherhood among the miners and a sense of strong community among the mining families. That's usually a factor there. And finally, the fiction usually ends, even after defeat of a miner strike or the occurrence of a disaster within a community, it will usually end upon a note of hope that somehow tomorrow has to be a better time. It is not my intention to suggest that these are the only themes or incidents found in mining fiction, or that even all of these themes or incidents will occur in every piece of mining fiction. It is, however, my intention to suggest that there are, amazingly, themes, ideas, attitudes, and values incorporated into the fiction of coal mining that seem to be multi- or international. In other words, I suspect, I don't know, that miners and mining families, wherever they live, and often whenever they live, if the fiction of coal mining is to believe, share a kind of mutual or universal camaraderie based upon similar life experiences. Now, the thing that bothers me, and the question that I have been in my mind quite often is, and you were talking about it, people out there, do they really understand coal miners? And I would say that most people get their idea of coal miners in a few ways. One way, when there is a disaster, they see it all over the paper and they see it on TV. When there's a strike, it's all over the TV and all over the newspaper. Now with the energy crunch, some people are aware that there are such things. And the other way they get it is through the fiction. And if the fiction is to believe it's a really deplorable life that most coal miners are living, quite often, there are a few optimistic notes in it. I don't know what can be done about it, but I kind of wonder, and this was my question, do the coal miners live the patterned existence that seems to come up in the fiction, or is it that the fiction has created a patterned life which people then begin to take and plug coal miners into? And I've often wondered. I have no answer for that.
Evelyn, if nobody will be offended, I'd like to interject something right at that point. First of all, you've listed some material that I personally would just love to have an opportunity to read through. There is a work done, I will give it as a story because I saw it in play form performed by a drama group over at Fairmont State a couple of years ago, called When the Bell Tolls. It's about a little mining community called Rachel, West Virginia, where I lived for 10 years. And it deals with the ethnic background of Rachel community. That is, there's Polish, Hungarian, Slovak, I want to say some of this correctly, and etc. And the tremendous prejudice that exists amongst neighbors. And that occurs, by the way, today. I just moved away 2 years ago. I can tell you first-handedly that you can literally watch neighbors sit across streets and hate one another as they wave at one another on Saturday morning, on a pretty Saturday morning. The story talks about the sort of love-hate relationship between a daughter of an Irishman and the son of a Polish man and woman of Polish descent, and the difficulties because of this ethnic origins. And then when the bell tolls at the turn of the century and announces the explosion of the Rachel mines, how the entire community sort of comes back together under one flag, as it were, and works together in a common goal. It's terribly interesting as far as I'm concerned. This is the type of thing, when I talk about lay persons and their interests and telling it from their perspective, and you keep talking about a theme within these communities, well, I can assure you you're correct. There is a very real theme, and it's one of the existing hazards, among other things. It's the economic conditions that might exist at a given time. There are a number of things. It's the levels of education available, not just the education attempts, but what's available and has been through the years. All of these things fit together. Ladies and gentlemen, with all due respect, I grew up in these communities too, and I live there now. And I am fortunate enough to have enough interest to take a little time to look around me. And I can assure you a great deal of it goes on yet today. And those works that you talk about, Ellen, some of which I've had the opportunity to read, and most of which I haven't. I would love to read some of that European work that you mentioned, just out of my own curiosity, if nothing else. But if you can attract the situation with those kinds of perspective, that's the same Francis did he's from Mannington, West Virginia, himself an immigrant, or son of an immigrant family, and excite interest amongst miners, I can assure your works will be read.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone?
I have a comment. There's a book that I read about a year or two ago about Indiana and Illinois miners. Italian family that comes to southern Indiana, I think, and then moves to Illinois, called Who Can Buy the Stars? And that's it.
People who lived it come to some conclusions about perceptions of life.
Yeah.
That's really where I'm headed. On one hand, with the oral history, which is their story. And on the other hand, that which has been written by those who sit on the outside and many times look at a mining mine. And I wonder where the truth lies. It lies someplace between the two, I think.
Let me comment on a couple of places where you were tempted to think that they had a very powerful novel and you wondered about the truth. The description you gave of early Scotch mining is very accurate in all the British coal mine histories. In other words, however shocking it is to you, the use of women as horsepower and of children is commonplace in English mining. But the yoking of the Scotch miners and the feudal conditions under which they were held is all by statute. That's all spelled out
By law?
way beyond. After all English miners were otherwise relatively free, they were attached to the land for hundreds of years after peasants, you see, and the whole status of feudalism.
The story ends as the fellow to defend his wife kills the mines.
Right. Well, I'd say you should know that because, you've done a superb work of bringing things together there, but you're questioning.
Yeah,
the other thing you questioned that was powerful is the Tennessee convict,
the convict labor.
miners' rebellion, and that is absolutely, and in fact, I don't know the novel, but the only thing he's changed is the last name of the miners' leader. He's even kept the first name. And no doubt, if I know that intimately, if you knew the rest of the circuit, he may have just followed, the whole story of the East Tennessee, which is the most successful defeat of troops by armed miners that I know of in the world. I mean, they completely captured the entire troops and packed them up on a train and sent them back to Knoxville. I mean, they were captured and disarmed and sent home, and they burned the stockades to the ground. There was no more complete defeat of troops sent in against miners than the Tennessee miners did, and they were knights of labor. And it's just a remarkable story that if the novel's followed, you should know that that's also very the one thing in the English thing that I've bumped into and I'm not satisfied with, but you might want to pursue, is that there's nothing that says that Dickens commented on, on miners, but if you had a way, I don't think it could be, you could research it as well from this end, if you had a way to discover whether there's been British studies done, I have a strong feeling that the unsigned short stories about miners in that thing that he put out later in life, some little weekly newspaper or monthly thing, which I've found a number of, that they're all his probably, because there's some of the Dickens biographies that say that he bought what he could and put other people's names on it, but he saved a lot of money by doing the rest of it himself, so that there are any number of short pieces about miners
So
that
if you
appear.
found a collected works of Dickens, would they?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to read some biographies and realize that there's some indication that stuff might be his, and then I have like Xeroxed them out of the library and just assumed they're his, but you might be interested in...
Where did you find it?
Well, I just took Dickens, biographies and went through this whole period, and then where he's commenting on everything else, looking to see if he said anything about miners, and then when you found the least indication of it, went and got the journals, that they were describing, and when you read them, they're more elaborate than their interest was in mining.
That's good, thank you very much. Anyone else have any contributions? Because I can sure use it. Save me some time tracking through all that stuff. It's not easy to sit and read bibliography.
This is somewhat of a follow-up on women and
mines in England. Ivy Pinchbeck's book on women in industry is a very explicit account of women in the mines and the workers, working without clothes on because of the heat and such.
This is not fiction, though.
No, it's not fiction.
But what's her name again?
Pinchbeck, Ivy Pinchbeck.
If you read Germinal, you'll get that too. The women literally work naked for the most part in the mines, and that's what amazed me. Guys, they're mining students. And look at this novel. They've got women in the mines with them practically on no clothes on. There's all this blood and guts and sex and going on in the mine. I know how much of that Zola overemphasized, I don't know. That's always the problem with fiction. You don't know how far they've gone and how much they've dramatized certain incidents, perhaps. And you have to be careful of it, I think. I ran across one other novel. It's taken me a year and a half to track it down. I finally got it out of NYU at Stony Brook, I think it came from. And it's called Black Earth, and it's about mining in Alabama. And I only got through the first chapter or so of it, and I find that we have a trainload of Italian immigrants coming in to break a strike, and they have now just been ambushed, and that's as far as I got because I had to come here. But whenever I read the
What's the name of that new one?
I think it's called Black Earth, if I'm not mistaken, and it's about mining in Alabama. If you want a specific name and
The author is,
I don't have the name of the author on the tip of my tongue.
What were those, you mentioned, was it two Eastern European things on
Yeah.
Shenandoah, Pennsylvania? What was
Yeah,
that?
they were short stories. I got them from a collection of short stories. I think the name of the book, all in all, is Our Fathers and We. And then within that book, there is a short story, Our Fathers and We. And then there is The Pit. And the other one is, yeah, The General. Right. The General is the guy who goes back in great triumph because he has made it big in Wilkes-Barre.
I wouldn't laugh that off. That sounds very accurate to me that they, arriving, you've read about the Social Security retirees in Poland right
Yeah,
today.
going back
They're
to
very
Poland,
wealthy. They're like,
Doing quite well.
they have servants and everything on our Social Security income today.
Evelyn, if I may, and if the group will permit me, I'd like to expand on this point about sort of underlying some kind of coherent thing that happens in a mining community. If I could, and this is a true story as opposed to fiction. It's not a novel. It's just an occurrence that I observed personally that might enlighten some of you. I don't know what its value is. We lived in Rachel community, the community I talked about that's the St. Francis wrote his story about when the bell's tolled. For 10 years, as I had said. We had a lady come there about 2 years after we moved there who was an alcoholic. She had 5 children. She was divorced, and she had came there from Toledo, Ohio. And my wife and her immediately struck up a friendship, and we were very sympathetic because we understood alcoholism, having had it within our own family structure years gone by. And so we took her sort of out of under wing, and we kept her there for 6 years. The lady had been drunk literally for 10 years before we met her. Well, we suffered much criticism in the community. I recall one occasion on a Sunday when 4 or 5 of the local miner community so-called leaders in the community came down and to my backyard, and we sit over my table there. I had like a picnic table in the backyard, and they, Ed, how in the world can you support this woman, and why do you defend her, and she's the worst thing that ever happened, and I could make some very off-color remarks, but I won't offend anybody about what I think their problem was. But in any event, we took a great deal of personal criticism in over a 5 or 6 year period. But to get to the point, she was upstairs getting her laundry together, about to go downstairs to put it in the wash. She heard a boom. There was an explosion. There was an open gasoline can in the basement where she also had an open fire gas type water heater. Her 2-year-old child was killed. don't want to get too involved in that, except to say the outpouring of sympathetic, not only words, but physical help. Clothes, the house burnt. Clothing, medical supplies, foodstuffs. Now, they're either the damnedest hypocrites I've ever met in my life, or there is an underlying humanity there that none of us really fully understand or could possibly understand until something like when the bell tolls of the mine explosion or when the lady lost her child. I have to spill that out because I think it's important. I think it says something about mining communities generally that I personally observe. Now, I might add, the lady's just this year finishing her 4th year at Fairmont State College, where she's been on the dean's list since she got there 3.5 years ago, and paid for by welfare. But she's majoring in sociology, and the governor can't wait till she gets out of college so he can grab her up. They need her. She was on welfare like 12, 14 years. She knows what the other half lives like. But you know, to have that kind of long endurance for an alcoholic, on the one hand, from my wife and my perspective, but to try to understand the perspective of the rest of the community, it was very, very difficult, to say the least, except for one time when tragedy struck, and by golly, they were there, you know, when we needed them, when she needed them. I don't know, y'all can just
No, I think this is
chew on
true.
that any way
It
you
comes through in
wish,
the
but
fiction too, that the people do stick together when there's a problem. Nobody says anything, I mean, you may be at each other's throats before, but if there is a problem, if there is a disaster, if there is an accident, I think this comes through in the fiction. People do stick together. There is a camaraderie.
I think you were stating it as a dilemma, though. In other words,
Yeah.
you're both,
it's true.
as a person in fiction and literature, you're troubled by the sameness of the themes.
Right.
And I'd more or less endorse the patriotism, so to speak, that Ed's expressing in the sense that in an alienated nation and living for the last 5 years in a supposedly enlightened academic community, it has no coherence. It has no sense of itself. Neighbors don't lift a hand for neighbors. You know, people come down with terminal illness and deaths, and it's a terrible limited support system, except, you know, the little bitty thing if they belong to the right church, if they, you know, if there was some coherence. There is just no sense of, in other words, the patriotism being that a nation that's really lost its sense of community as a working class entity that isn't lost, it hasn't moved over to vote for Reagan. In other words, it's a shocker in this country to understand this. You know, it's not that easy to throw these people. You look at the 1968 precincts around the whole United States. George Wallace penetrated them, I'm certain. Throughout Ohio, he penetrated them, and in Michigan, he didn't budge them. You know, in the white working class precincts, you know, he just doesn't make inroads. People say nigger, and people say things that the nice people in this room don't say, but you don't drink after a black man is drunk from the pint bottle, and these guys do. You know, I mean, there's a, that's not hypocrisy, and that's why I'm endorsing that. What that is a level of true nationhood and community that middle-class people just are, you know, have to back away from. It's like, it's overdone, but what if the disaster is the unifying force? It is an absolute reflection of life. Will you tell me when the miners have ever in eternity made any progress anywhere in the world? You know, in 1907, the biggest mine explosion in all U.S. history takes place, and we get a Bureau of Mines. Till then, absolutely not. The biggest labor leader that America ever created could cry before Senate committees for this or that. Until Centralia, until the horrible disasters after World War II, you don't get the next piece of legislation, the 1952 legislation. And until Farmington number 9, with the accident of media coverage for 10 long days, That's all. If the TV cameras, if they could have shut it up like Haydn, if they could have closed it and sealed it like most of these mine disasters, but the fact the American public got to see it, I mean, it's a reflection of reality. I mean, it's not a strained thing like they're making nobody's making up any images. This is the only goddamn time anybody gives a goddamn about the miners. You're exactly right. It's only when he's on strike, and he knows it. The anthracite miners knew it till anthracite died, The bitumen, they know it instinctively, that there's no respect for them. There's no acknowledging their role. There's no recognizing that coal is better than oil as an American resource. This is all talk by Carter, by Ford, by Nixon, and it'll be by Reagan, Won't be a goddamn recognition of anything. When they shut the goddamn nation down, somebody knows they're alive. It's a thing we've just got to sort of, and you're right. You've done a beautiful job, even if you're expressing doubts, that it's worldwide. That's my observation. I was telling Harold just a few minutes ago, the thing that struck me in trying to turn to him as a resource in anthracite is that the one coal field I've finished up, I'm satisfied I don't need another resource on, we're slaves. We're American slaves produce coal. And it's amazing. They couldn't get away with it without amending slavery. In other words, the slaveholder ideologist comes down there to visit the mine and he scolds them. What is this? Letting them make decisions. What is this? They're property. You hire them, you borrow them from others, you pay $100 a year for them, and then you let them make decisions. Then you decide on real property values based on whether they decide there's enough coal. I mean, he's just horrified at what he finds underground and in the minds of the slaveholders that own the coal as he observes coal production in Virginia in 1817 and again in 1830 when he goes underground. This secessionist, the guy who fires the shot at Sumter. He's a total ideologist of slavery, and it, like, to me, was the last word. You follow me? It's not only all over the world they're the same. Under capitalism, they've got to amend for them. Let Dr. Morgan scream his bloody soul out. The Southern textile workers aren't equal to coal miners in brutal sense. They're not unionized. They can't get the goddamn thing, so one group gets black lung and the other doesn't get brown lung. Terribly unfair, right? So it's terribly unfair, and he says, so therefore take away black lung from the coal miners. That's not how America makes progress. When one group can lobby and get something for the working class, you admire them for it. You respect them for it. I'm just simply saying there is a uniqueness, and you simply in literature pointed to it, but all history would bear it out. I don't know of any evidence anywhere in the world that if the Polish miners become the last ones holding out, you better believe solidarity will go under, and ideology will go under, and the dissonance will go under. But if the miners say, but we're going out for 10 more goddamn days, the whole Communist Party come down there and hold a meeting with the miners. They won't mess with the dissonance. They won't mess with anybody else, but they'll have to settle with coal miners in the end.
I think it's kind of interesting that usually, I think you're right. I was thinking that myself. If Russia it does attack Poland, I think they're in for trouble when they get down into the Silesia and the southern part there. Just to root those people out is going to be bad enough, and the miners have a full reputation. It comes through in the literature. It doesn't matter whether they're American or not.
Oh, yeah, we're all hard-headed, I'll tell you.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joyce has finished his master's degree, our thesis called Miners of the Prairies, Life and Labor of Wilmington, Illinois Coal Vein, 1866 to 1869, or 97, excuse me. Good thing we're only having one paper tonight. Trying to, ever since Penn State put that no smoking in the classroom, well, I cannot smoke, talk at the same time, completely destroyed me. And tonight he's going to talk about Dan Mclaughlin. Without further ado, since it's a very close-knit operation, turn it forward.
Okay. The coal mining region of northern Illinois has received scant attention from professional historians. Those few who have written about the area have largely focused their attention on the town of Braidwood, located 65 miles southwest of Chicago. Mushrooming from the prairie in 1865, it rapidly became the most important coal mining town in Illinois. The Braidwood area in late 1860s and early 1870s was mainly populated by immigrant miners from the British Isles, many of whom were experienced unionists. The town has a largely forgotten but important heritage, for during its heyday it became a seedbed of national miners' leaders, the birthplace and boyhood home of John Mitchell, and the resting place of local #1 of the United Mine Workers of America. Braidwood's best-known citizen during its tenure as the Midwest's premier mining locale was Daniel Mclaughlin, who lived there from 1869 to 1889. Largely forgotten today except by a handful of historians who have studied immigrants or miners, McLaughlin's name was a household word among thousands of workmen on both sides of the Atlantic a century ago. Although several writers have touched upon certain of his accomplishments, no single study of his entire life and influence exists. Such a study can reveal much about the objectives and tactics of the miner's leader, the social and industrial relationships in small coal towns, the peculiar problems of the coal industry, and the wide variety of sometimes contradictory ideas that were current in the American labor movement in the late 19th century. While the materials perhaps do not allow for a book-length study, Mclaughlin certainly deserves more attention as one of the nation's foremost labor leaders of his day. Mclaughlin was born in Scotland in 1831, son of an Irish Catholic stonecutter. He entered the mines at age 9, and he took part in a successful 22-week strike of Scotland's miners in 1842. 5 years later, during a strike in 1847, he made his first public appearance as an agitator and an enemy to injustice and oppression. At this time, he met and formed a lifelong friendship with Alexander MacDonald, who was the leader of the British miners and later a member of Parliament. From 1847 to 1868, Mclaughlin took an active and prominent part in all matters of reform in the interest of the wage workers of Britain, gaining a national reputation so much so that he found it almost impossible to get employment in his native land. He served as both president and secretary of the Maryhill Scotland Miners' Union, and he collaborated with MacDonald and others to gain the 8-hour day for many British miners in the mid-1860s. Perhaps encouraged by reports of Alexander MacDonald, who toured America's mining regions in both 1867 and 1869, Mclaughlin emigrated in the latter year. After spending a brief time in New York, Boston, and Chicago, he came to Braidwood and was urged to stay by an old friend and fellow worker under MacDonald, John James, who took him on as a partner in the mine. Braidwood, Illinois became his home for the next 2 decades. Like many other immigrants, Mclaughlin's first impressions of life and work in the United States were enthusiastic and full of promise. In a letter written from Braidwood less than a month after his arrival, he reported that he was sending money home to his wife and that a hard worker during busy times could make $100 per month, while only $40 was needed to keep a very large family. The miner's breakfast, he noted, consisted of potatoes, beef, bread and butter, pies, and all kinds of fancy meats, and the miners carried meat in their lunch pails. While the work was hard, he assured his friend, do not form a bad opinion of the country from what I have said about the work. Wait till I let you know how they live and get rich. I assure you everybody lives well. As will be seen, future events definitely altered his opinions. Mclaughlin did not allow his initial optimism to erase from his mind the lessons of his earlier life, nor did he shy away from those activities which had caused him full employment across the Atlantic. The worker, he felt, needed the protection of his fellows and the fight for better conditions, wages, and hours. Perhaps encouraged by the presence of many of his old associates, Mclaughlin joined the Working Man's Industrial Society, which was headed by Richard F. Travelick, a labor organizer from Detroit. From his earliest years in Braidwood, the local miners were highly aware and supportive of Mclaughlin's efforts. In a town meeting held in 1871, for example, Mclaughlin, on rising, was greeted with cheers from more than 500 persons, those outside as well as inside the hall. In 1871 and 72, Mclaughlin cooperated with John James, who was then the leader of Illinois miners, in a successful effort to pass Illinois' first Mine Safety and Inspection Act. Mclaughlin was one of 3 chosen to help rewrite the bill after an earlier draft had failed in 1871. By 1873, Mclaughlin was playing a more active role in helping his fellow workmen, and from these activities we get our first glimpse of his philosophy and advice. He presided at a meeting of Braidwood area miners in May, for example, and advised them to do nothing rash or inconsiderate, to consider the interest of their employers as well as their own, but to adhere to their decisions once made. After a long speech by Travelick, the miners voted to ask their employers for an 8-hour day. They also passed a set of resolutions asking for minor representation, helping write the annual contracts they signed, binding arbitration of differences between the men and the companies, and declaring strikes to be an injurious last resort. Further evidence of Mclaughlin's philosophy is revealed in a letter he wrote in October 1873. He had accompanied John James to a miners' convention in Youngstown, Ohio, which created the Miners National Association, with John Siney of Pennsylvania as president. John James wrote the organization's constitution and became national secretary, and Mclaughlin became a member of the executive board, helped to write a letter which was sent to the mining communities throughout the land. While praising the efforts of local, district, and state miners' organizations, the writer stated that only a national organization embracing all miners could prevent them from becoming helpless hewers of wood and drawers of water when faced with the merciless demands of soulless corporations. Based on the principles of arbitration, conciliation, and cooperation, the new union vowed to fight for the social, intellectual, and physical improvement of the miners, and to protect their God-given rights and Republican institutions. Using as its motto, defense and not defiance, the organization, the letter revealed, is purely protective and defensive in its character, willing to yield to capital its just rewards. The Miners National Association sought as members all miners, and it made appeals to black miners similar to those used in later decades by its descendant, the United Mine Workers of America. Mclaughlin and his colleagues wrote, "No religious, political, or nationalistic test is required. In a special cordial invitation to what they called our colored brethren," they continued, "we recognize but two classes, the men who labor and the men who live from the proceeds of others' labor, the robber and the robbed, no matter what color. We are willing to take you by the hand as fellow toilers, entitled to the same privileges and benefits which we claim for ourselves, asking in return only an honest, hearty, and undivided support of our principles and organization." Returning to Illinois as recognized leader of the state's organized miners, Mclaughlin tramped the mining communities of northern Illinois seeking members and dues money for the new union, sent aid to Pennsylvania strikers, and journeyed to Springfield to lobby again for improvements in the state mining law. Unfortunately, his efforts were interrupted by harsh economic realities. The result of the Panic of 1873 was a sharp business slowdown, accompanied by a decline in demand for coal. Forced to scurry for available spring contracts, coal operators cut miners' wages in an attempt to offer their product at cheaper prices. At Braidwood, the coal company sought to reduce the miners' pay by 25 cents per ton in the annual contracts to begin June 1st, 1874. When the compromise efforts of President Siney failed, the Braidwood miners voted to strike in opposition to the proposed reduction, despite the warning by Mclaughlin that the strike would probably last until the demand for coal increased in the late fall. In a remarkable series of interviews done by the Chicago Tribune early in the strike, local coal operators described Mclaughlin as a quiet man, a fair-spoken, easygoing person who goes about his business with little fuss, yet he's a man who sways most of the miners at his will. The reporter found Mclaughlin to be a medium-sized man with an intelligent countenance, a mild and unobtrusive manner, a British accent, and a chin-burdened mustache. Mclaughlin stated that the miners were willing to submit the entire matter to arbitration and that he didn't feel that strikes were good policy, but he criticized the companies. "We don't want to drive the companies to the wall. If they would only come out like men and be frank with us and say how they are fixed, why, we are not so bad, but what we would come to terms. But they ignore us entirely. It could not be worse treatment in the old country." Throughout the strike, the miners repeated their offer to submit the matter to arbitration, and the companies consistently refused. During the strike, Mclaughlin blamed the company for setting fire to some of their old boarding houses so that they might excite the country against the miners and bring in outside police protection. Such action on the part of the companies had the opposite effect locally, for the mayor, sheriff, judges, merchants, and townspeople strongly supported the miners. For example, when 75 Pinkerton detectives arrived to protect company property, they were promptly disarmed by a deputy sheriff who said he feared them more than the miners. A group of strikers were deputized to protect the town, while others met imported strikebreakers as they disembarked from trains, convinced them of the duplicity of the companies, and helped pay their transportation out of town. Local officials mercilessly arrested and fined company detectives and workers who violated the law, and a group of strikers' wives attacked 4 of the old miners who had agreed to clean out one of the shafts. Faced with such opposition, the company appealed to the governor for aid, and he sent the head of the Illinois militia to Braidwood to investigate. But these actions of Adjutant General E.L. Higgins further polarized the situation. The miners accused him of being a company agent who helped bring workers to the shaft, packed like cattle in boxcars, and the mayor bitterly resented his presence. As the impoverished polyglot miners remained united despite company efforts to sow dissension amongst the various nationalities, and the inefficient strikebreakers increasingly became a burden to the companies, a settlement became more likely. Finally, on September 4th, the strike ended with a compromise which the miners hailed as a great victory. The strike made a deep and lasting impression on Dan Mclaughlin. At a large local meeting following the strike, he praised the miners for their perfect unity of action. He undoubtedly noticed the importance of local political control during the strike, and he filed the idea away for future reference. In the ensuing months, as congratulations and praise for the miners' success poured into Braidwood, he continued his efforts to improve the miners' position. At a meeting held in Ottawa, Illinois, only a week after the end of the strike, for example, he urged Northern Illinois miners to support the monetary reformer Alexander Campbell for Congress. In the state legislative races, he suggested that workmen only vote for those candidates promising to amend the mining law and abolish the notorious LaSalle Black Law, an anti-strike weapon passed with employer support in 1863. His advice was apparently heeded, as Campbell was elected from the 7th District of Illinois to Congress. Furthermore, two Braidwood residents, Luke Goodrich and William Mooney, were elected to the General Assembly in Illinois. The former had been the town's pro-miner mayor during the strike, and the latter was an immigrant miner who became a lawyer. On the organizational level, he stumped Southern Illinois for the Union, stressed his desire for a closer bond of union between the mining towns of Northern Illinois, and noted the need for the prompt payment of dues. Under his influence, the Union prevented the establishment of the truck store system of paying wages of Braidwood. But Mclaughlin's activities were not confined to the local level. In October 1875, he triumphantly attended and took part in the second annual convention of the Miners' National Association in Cleveland. In mid-July 1875, he helped write a letter suggesting that miners everywhere contribute to a legal defense fund for the miners of Clearfield, Pennsylvania, who were arrested for conspiracy. He also helped collect over $600 from Northern Illinois miners, which was sent to the strikers in Indiana. Again, however, McLaughlin's efforts were only partially successful and not always appreciated. When John Siney and Working Man's Advocate editor Andrew Cameron visited Braidwood in late 1875, they noted the town's growth. But Siney regretted that some of the workmen had grown lukewarm in possession of the city authorities, and he complied. The next day, troops searched individual homes for weapons. The general met with the mayor and warned of further action if rioting continued, and the black miners began to return to town. A few days later, Governor Shelby Cullom visited the town, and he repeated warnings to the mayor and other officials. With peace thus restored, the troops left on August 9th, but not before the mayor was arrested and taken to Joliet to post bond for preventing the sheriff and his posse from entering the town. While a hostile Joliet newspaper headlined the story with the words, "At last," a paper in a nearby town said the arrest was merely a formality and offered, "Personally, we believe the mayor is a law-abiding citizen and a kind-hearted gentleman, though born to hate the encroachment of capital as against labor." Papers and persons who speak of Daniel Mclaughlin as an outlaw and rioter simply show that they know nothing of this much-abused official. As the battle of words regarding the events dragged on in the press, so did the strike. The miners became increasingly impoverished, and the companies continued operating with their inefficient labor force, while the town increasingly lost many skilled miners and their families. By late November, the strikers succumbed to the company's terms, but only after a promise to pay back the wages owed since last April. In a post-strike letter to the National Labor Tribune, the Miners' Central Committee, headed by Mclaughlin, called upon workers everywhere to unite against capital, and it correctly predicted many of us will be victimized. It concluded, "We are defeated but not dead. He who conquers by force conquers only half his foe. We thank the noble-hearted who have assisted and hope for the day when no such means need be resorted to as strikes to have our rights." The strike of 1877 had a devastating effect on Braidwood. Hundreds of white miners moved away while the blacks became a permanent part of the town's population. Several small businesses closed, and those merchants that remained had to compete with company stores which came into existence during the strike. Miners who returned to work were forced to trade at these stores, while several old miners, including Mayor Mclaughlin and other local officials, were blacklisted. At least one of the small coal companies went out of business, and others were severely affected financially. The years 1877 and 1878 represent a watershed in the life of Dan Mclaughlin. They witnessed the bitter end of his old relationship with John James, a political success which opened new possibilities for solving workers' problems, the doubts and struggles of a middle-aged man attempting to survive financially, and a new desire to try a large national approach to solve the ills of the mining industry. John James, a former secretary of the Miners National Association, returned to Braidwood in December 1876 when that organization collapsed. He found work as a clerk in the office of one of the coal companies and was apparently swayed to fight for its interests. In the township, municipal, and school board elections held in the spring of 1878, for example, James and the coal company officials sought to unite Braidwood's Democrats and Republicans to oppose the local greenback labor ticket, whose candidates were mostly blacklisted miners. James and his cohorts charged that the company property had been unfairly assessed and that elected greenback labor officials had illegally misused public funds to help support striking miners. Mclaughlin and the other greenbackers accused James of trying to destroy the blacklisted men and force them from the town. James, in his defense, stated that he fought the greenback ticket because they had failed to hold true to their promises of serving only one term and reducing taxes. He further stated that those who attacked him and the coal companies were enemies of the true interests of the working people. James said of his opponents, "They failed to discover that their own egotism, ambition, and incompetency unfit them to either lead or teach." Mclaughlin replied that James failed to prove any of his charges, but that he was instead relying on barefaced lies. He wrote, "John, your day of figuring and fooling the people, especially the mining classes, is past." Thus the debate raged on through the summer of 1878, and thus ended a friendship that began before either man set foot on American soil. One may wonder how Mclaughlin supported his wife and 6 children while blacklisted. He was still mayor and may have drawn a small salary in that post. In addition, he was president of a cooperative store formed by working men in January 1877 and may have profited from money invested there. Like many of Braidwood's miners, Mclaughlin owned his home, and he relied heavily upon his garden and livestock for sustenance. A reporter who questioned him on the subject in June 1878 received this reply: "I have 4 pigs, a cow, 300 chickens, and had new potatoes for dinner. That is how I can stand it." Finally, in November 1878, Mclaughlin and the other victimized miners were allowed to return to work in the mines after being frozen out for a year. The winter of 1878 and 79 may have been Mclaughlin's last as a practical miner. For in the next decade, he expanded his efforts and became a nationally known orator and labor organizer. In these years, he devoted himself to a number of causes, but he remained most interested in aiding the nation's miners. Mclaughlin had joined the Knights of Labor in 1876, and he organized Local 376 at Braidwood in August 1877 during the strike. In the ensuing years, he pursued its goals of organization, education, cooperation, and arbitration. At a speech he made in Springfield on February 27, 1879, for example, he denounced the avarice and tyranny of soulless corporations, which had paid too little attention to the proper distribution of the products of labor. He pointed out the value of trade unions, urged workers to send lobbyists to the state legislature, and stressed the importance of the ballot. Mclaughlin and another prominent miner were sent to Springfield that same month by the state's miners. Together with other labor lobbyists, they were successful in having bills passed which made truck stores illegal, improved mine ventilation, and created a state bureau of labor statistics. While in that area, he spoke often to the miners of central Illinois, urging them to organize, vote on election day, and reduce their hours of toil in accordance with the increase of machinery. He urged working men to read the National Labor Tribune and other labor papers. And in the former's column, he prophetically wrote, "We hope the time is not far distant when working men will unite and send men from their own ranks to the legislature." Returning to Northern Illinois, he spoke at LaSalle, Streator, and Braidwood, telling miners to restrict their coal output so as to prevent overproduction, endorsing the 8-hour movement, denouncing monopolists and labor-saving machinery, urging the creation of a national miners' union, and warning miners not to strike unless the suspension was nationwide. But Mclaughlin did not restrict himself to activities in Illinois. In August 1879, for example, he and John Young journeyed to Maine to speak for greenback labor candidates. Later that year and into 1880, he was involved in efforts to raise money for the oppressed tenants of Ireland. When Irish patriot Michael Davitt and poetess Emily Gavin spoke at Braidwood in August 1880, Mclaughlin introduced them and heartily endorsed their cause. In September of 1880, he traveled to the Ninth Labor Convention in Pittsburgh and was elected to the organization's executive board. Mclaughlin's greatest success in 1880, however, occurred in the spring, when he helped Northern Illinois miners negotiate a new contract which won them a check weighman, shorter hours, abolition of the Yellow Dog Clause, and a 10% and a 10-cent per ton advance. This higher wage was augmented by the fact that the coal companies agreed to change their screens to allow the miner more pay for his work. Also beneficial was the implementation of the sliding scale, which guaranteed the miner 40% of any advance in the price of coal during the contract. Mclaughlin praised the sliding scale as one of the great levers to prevent strikes and lockouts in the future. His efforts were highly appreciated by the miners. When he spoke at Streator, a mining town southwest of Braidwood, on March 23rd, for example, he was applauded until the hall rang with the voices of the multitude. 6 weeks later, a correspondent from the same town wrote, "Mclaughlin is well liked by young and old. He was always a welcome guest here." Throughout the summer and fall of 1880, Mclaughlin stumped the coal towns for his favorite causes. His efforts on behalf of the oppressed tenants of Ireland has already been mentioned. He also traveled with 8-hour advocate Richard Travelick in June, and in October he introduced greenback labor presidential candidate James B. Weaver to Illinois miners. Mclaughlin himself ran unsuccessfully on that party's ticket for state representative in 1880. The 1880 contract is significant for several reasons. It proves that as the economy improved and the demand for coal increased, the company officials were willing to give workmen a share of the profits. The improved contract and the higher wages it allowed revealed to both coal operator and union official that cooperation with previously hostile adversaries was possible. From this success, one can speculate that Mclaughlin became convinced that the state of the coal industry, and not the whim of the individual operator, was what determined company policy. To help both miner and operator, something had to be done about the coal industry. Mclaughlin's thoughts on this matter bore much fruit in the mid-1880s. In the summer of 1880, Dan Mclaughlin found time amidst his activities to write several revealing letters to the National Labor Tribune. These letters were a response to prominent Ohio miner Andrew Roy, who stated that the Miners' National Association of the mid-1870s collapsed because of ill-begotten local strikes which drained the organization's treasury. Mclaughlin, who had been a member of the organization's executive board, denied these assertions and offered his own ideas on the association's downfall. More interesting, however, are his somewhat autobiographical opinions and views on local strikes, their causes, and their leaders. What caused local strikes? Mclaughlin felt that wage reductions were only part of the problem. He wrote, "The majority of the miners are not so ignorant as not to know that their labor and the produce of their labor is subject to fluctuations in market conditions, the same as all the workmen's labor and produce. But when the market is in such a state that a reduction in prices is almost inevitable, and men meet to consider the matter, all other wrongs and oppressions they have been subjected to float before their memory like so many black clouds, and their blood gets warm when they think on the many injustices that they have to suffer. And when these thoughts get uppermost, all the conservative element in the village cannot prevent a strike. Every harsh word and act of oppression is remembered till a day of reckoning comes, and a large number of poor men think that day has come when the opportunity for a strike has presented itself. What was his opinion of the local leaders of strikes? He denied that they are the hot-headed, clamorous fellows, but instead he described them as men like himself. Local leaders are not as a rule agitators of strikes, but when, through the force of circumstances, a strike takes place, they stand their ground and help to keep the men together, and are prepared at all times before any tribunal to argue the justness of the men's claims, and to defend them against all slanders and lies that may be hurled at them through the press or otherwise. It is true that local leaders are staunch trade unionists and have great faith in the principles of trade organizations, and they never miss when opportunity occurs to impress in the minds of their fellow men that the only way they can prevent those useless strikes, so long as the present social system exists, is to be well prepared for them by and through a thorough system of trades organization and cooperation. These are the ideas and opinions of 9/10 of all local leaders that I have come across the minds in the last 40 years. They know that strikes as a rule will always bring poverty and suffering to those engaged in them, whether they win or lose, until we are so organized that men can be set to work on their own account. So long as men have to be maintained in idleness, or allowed to go to work for other employers under no better circumstances than where they first refused to work, strikes will fall short of accomplishing the object sought for. What was the cure for these suspensions of work? Mclaughlin proposed, we must work to remove the causes, and the bosses and superintendents must be made to understand that miners are not beasts of burden, and that kind words and just, honorable, and fair treatment will do more to lessen the number and frequency of strikes than all the victimizing and blacklisting that has been or will be to the end of time. In 1881, Mclaughlin received greater recognition for his efforts. In April, the miners of Northern Illinois appointed him as an organizer, and he again devoted time and effort instructing and advising the state's underground toilers. He remained active in the Knights of Labor, attending their 1881 convention in Detroit. Also in that year, he was elected to another term as Braidwood's mayor on the greenback ticket, even though the Republicans carried a majority of their candidates into office. During his second term as Braidwood's mayor, Mclaughlin again scored an important legislative victory on behalf of Illinois miners. On February 16, 1883, 69 miners perished when water rushed into the diamond mine just northwest of Braidwood. Mclaughlin immediately began raising a relief fund for the distressed widows and orphans. It had ultimately totaled over $40,000. More importantly, he seized upon the emotional impact of the disaster to seek improvements in the state's mining law. For years, miners had complained that the 1872 law, which instructed county boards to appoint, supervise, and pay mine inspectors, was woefully inadequate. In both 1881 and 1882, the report of the State Bureau of Labor Statistics documented the laxity of certain counties' attempts to enforce the law and recommended changes. These recommendations, aided by the fervent lobbying of Mclaughlin and others from the state's mining regions, led to the passage of a comprehensive mining law in June 1885. This new law, which was favored by many of the state's operators who were unhappy with the previous haphazard enforcement, featured improved requirements for ventilation and escapement shafts. More important, the law provided that the state would appoint, supervise, and pay qualified mine inspectors. This law improved mine safety and removed, at least for a while, one of the miners' main complaints. For his efforts on behalf of the state's workmen, Daniel Mclaughlin was unanimously elected to chair the organizational meeting of the Illinois Federation of Labor by 104 cheering delegates who met in Chicago March 26, 1884. I think I said the mining law was 1885, it was 1883. At this convention, he was elected to a one-year term as second vice president of the Illinois Federation of Labor. As the mid-1880s approached, the leadership of men like Mclaughlin was sorely needed by the miners. The prosperity they had enjoyed earlier in the decade faded as the nation's expanding railroad network and increased use of other forms of energy again created competition among the coal operators, and another period of wage cuts began. Braidwood area miners, for example, accepted reductions of 5 cents per ton in both 1883 and 1884. These developments, combined with the disastrous 9-month strike of the latter year in Ohio's Hocking Valley, convinced miners leaders and some operators that a better response to the crisis in coal had to be found, and Dan Mclaughlin played a key role in this movement. In June 1885, he was re-elected president of the state's miners, and he and two other officers were given $50 a month to tramp the state to build a stronger organization. He wholeheartedly went to work exhorting the state's miners to become greater organized and educated. During the summer of 1885, Mclaughlin and Ohio miner leader John McBride arranged a meeting of the organized miners of the various states in an attempt to form another national union. That call was answered by 35 delegates from 7 states, who created the National Federation of Miners and Mine Laborers. Mclaughlin was elected chairman of the convention, which met in Indianapolis in early September. The delegates chose him to be national treasurer and to serve on the national executive board. But the formation of a new union was only part of Mclaughlin's plans, which he had hinted about in a series of letters to the National Labor Tribune in August 1885. The coming convention, he wrote, is to adopt a plan, and one that will be practical and productive of great good. Men of age and experience in our own ranks know that all of our employers are not tyrants nor oppressors, but the competitive system that is destroying our lives and sapping the foundation of our liberties compels the fair-minded and generous-hearted to follow the footsteps of the sordid and selfish. The question then comes up, will we act independently, or will we take our friends and well-wishers into counsel and confidence with us? In addition to electing him to various important positions, the delegates accepted Mclaughlin's advice and issued a call to the coal operators to meet the miners for the purpose of adjusting the market and mining prices in such a way as to avoid strikes and lockouts and give to each party an increased profit from the sale of coal. Only a few operators responded, but among these were important coal barons W.P. Rend of Ohio and A.L. Sweet of Illinois. The group jointly issued another letter to all operators asking for another meeting at Pittsburgh in December. To celebrate the new feeling of cooperation between the miners and operators, a huge parade and meeting were held in Braidwood on November 4th. Speakers included Mclaughlin and his old nemesis, A.L. Sweet, president of the Chicago, Wilmington, and Vermilion Coal Company. But even better results were forthcoming. The meeting of miners and operators at the well-attended Pittsburgh meeting of December 1885 formulated an across-the-board increase in the price of coal, so that cutthroat competition among operators would be decreased and miners' wages could improve. Since some of the operators could not agree on proper wage and price differentials, however, a final settlement was not reached until February 23, 1886. On that day at Columbus, 77 operators and 36 miners' representatives agreed on a one-year wage scale to become effective the following May 1st. The agreement covered mining districts in 6 coal-producing states, and it set up arbitration boards to settle disputes. Mclaughlin and Sweet were both put to these boards. The interstate wage price agreement, termed by historians a conspicuous experiment in labor industry cooperation and a landmark in the history of collective bargaining, was designed to let the operators into the different markets on an equality in regard to prices paid for mining. It sought to artificially equalize peculiar local differences in the difficulty and cost of mining and transporting coal. This new departure in avoiding disastrous competition greatly increased the respect between operators and miners, and it lasted, with several disastrous interruptions, for nearly half a century. Dan Mclaughlin, hailed as the father of the joint convention system for the adjustment of miners' wages by an annual scale, worked hard in the late 1880s to keep that fragile agreement effective. He attended the annual joint conferences of miners and operators, and he continued serving on the National Arbitration Board. Dedicated to the idea that a strong organization was required to force recalcitrant operators' obedience to the agreement, he remained active in miners' unionism on both the state and national levels. Affectionately referring to him as the Old War Horse, or Old Dan, the miners regarded him as an oracle, and the elder statesman's beneficial influence on those who followed him is undeniable. Nowhere is this more evident than in his hometown of Braidwood. More than anyone else, Mclaughlin made the town a city on a hill, a beacon, and a light to the non-union miner. At least 6 miners who lived in that town or near it in the 1870s and 1880s later became state or national officers of the United Mine Workers of America. They include Alex Howitt, who was head of the Kansas miners, I think, that challenged John L. Lewis. Ebenezer Howells, who was a state official. William D. Ryan, later became Secretary-Treasurer, United Mine Workers. William Scaife, later head of Illinois Miners, member of the first Executive Board of the United Mine Workers of America, 1890, later editor of United Mine Workers Journal. John Hunter Walker, important Illinois unionist, and of course, John Mitchell, 5th President of the United Mine Workers. Until 1889, Mclaughlin was both President of the Illinois Miners Union and a national officer of the National Federation of Miners and Mine Laborers. An Ohio miner writing in 1899 described Mclaughlin with respect. Dan was one of the ablest and most level-headed leaders the miners ever had. He was a man of strong willpower, an earnest, eloquent talker, a deep thinker, a good reasoner, and a man of firm convictions. At the national conventions, one man recalled seeing important leaders from the various states listening to Mclaughlin, like Paul sitting at the feet of Gamaliel, while counsel was being taken as to the welfare of the National Union. Mclaughlin's talents won him further respect and rewards. In 1885, for example, he was chosen to be a member of the Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics, which he had helped create by effective lobbying 6 years earlier. His political career also flowered, and he was elected state representative in 1886 and re-elected in 1888. In Springfield, he fought for the 8-hour day, bi-weekly pay for miners, abolition of truck stores, improved mine safety and gross weight pay laws, and the examination and registration of mine managers and pit bosses. Always in great demand as a speaker, he traveled to Pennsylvania at least twice in the late 1880s to help other labor organizations. He also served 2 terms as first vice president of the American Federation of Labor in the late 1880s. As second in command, he was instructed to prepare to take control of that organization by disgruntled Samuel Gompers in May 1889. But Gompers didn't resign, and Mclaughlin didn't take over. Old Dan had other plans in the spring of 1889. In early June, he left Braidwood on a journey to Denver, Colorado to visit his son and family. While in Colorado, he accepted the superintendency of the Trinidad Coal and Coke Company's mine at Starkville. Why did Mclaughlin so suddenly abandon his life's work and accept the coal company's position? To ask this question is not to castigate him, for if anything, what was most unique about his long career as a labor leader was his ability to persevere in the face of innumerable obstacles. Also, one must remember that several miners' leaders in these early years crossed over into the ranks of the operators. Certainly Mclaughlin's advancing age was a factor, as well as the fact that for years he had subsisted on the meager, uncertain salary of the early union official. One of his friends later recalled that in these years his position was not a bed of roses, as Dan had frequently to tramp the ties and sleep under the roof of heaven, and not a few times on an empty stomach. Another writer provided another reason, stating, after nearly a lifetime of work, he got tired of the undeserving kicks and cuffs of which he was the recipient. Local conditions at Braidwood may also help to explain his departure. As competition in coal markets increased in the late 1880s, the interstate wage agreement was broken by a number of operators and miners in the various states and districts, all of whom were seeking a competitive advantage. In the spring of 1889, Mclaughlin urged Northern Illinois miners to accept the reduction and remain working, and many Braidwood men took his advice and signed their new annual contracts. Other leaders, however, were determined to fight the reduction, and they convinced enough of the men that a strike was commenced. Mclaughlin denounced the pro-strike leaders as knaves and deceivers, who would someday have to do penance in sackcloth and ashes for the ruin they have brought on our people. He also criticized those miners who had traveled to southern Illinois to work below union scale while northern Illinois was on a strike. In response to Mclaughlin's comments, a group of northern Illinois strike leaders censured him, and one observer gave him this advice: "You are out of the fight and have no reason to get into it, especially to oppose the will of those who have been your friends." Mclaughlin's comments in the National Labor Tribune also reflect a disdain for the ethnic changes then occurring in the Northern Illinois mining workforce. In the 1860s and 1870s, the English-speaking miners had been predominant. But by the late 1880s, new immigrants, primarily Italians and Bohemians, were crowding into the coal fields. Mclaughlin, like many of his contemporaries, incorrectly judged these newcomers to be poor soil for the plant of unionism. During the 1889 strike, for example, he wrote, "I am sorry for the English-speaking miners of Braidwood, two-thirds of whom I have known since they were boys." From Denver, he wrote, "That our young men speak the English language should come west and take up farming. And of mining, he told them, to make an effort to get away from such a cursed and unhealthy calling and leave it for those of whose growling habits and slavish dispositions fits them better for such a miserable condition in life." Dan Mclaughlin apparently served well as superintendent of the Trinidad Coal and Coke Company, for he remained in that position for 11 years. He was able to give employment to a number of his old Braidwood friends. Among these was young John Mitchell, later president of the United Mine Workers, who lived with Mclaughlin's family for a while. When Mclaughlin retired in 1900, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation, which now owned the Trinidad operation, kept him on the payroll as an honorary employee, and his son James was allowed to succeed him as superintendent. In early 1901, Mclaughlin complained of a soreness in his throat, which continued to grow more painful. In April, his son Tom took him to Chicago's Mercy Hospital for an operation. Although the operation was apparently successful, Mclaughlin's recovery was halted by pneumonia, which claimed his life on May 1st, 1901. Two of his eulogies stand out. Ohio miner and historian Andrew Roy wrote, "The miners and operators of the United States should join and erect a monument to his memory. They owe him this debt of gratitude." William Scaife, Mclaughlin's successor as head of the Illinois miners, penned the following: "He was a national figure, and his name was a household word, the synonym for honesty and integrity. He has left a name that should be inscribed high on the roll book of miners' leaders." The labor career of Dan Mclaughlin reveals much about labor organizations and social relations in the late 19th century America. It proves, as Herbert Gutman has so adequately shown, that capital investment did not always translate into political and social power in small industrializing towns. The middle classes often supported the workers, and labor leaders were highly respected by many people, despite the anti-union rhetoric of the often hostile press. Although unions were not always strong, enough labor militancy often existed to limit the alternatives available to the coal companies. Furthermore, significant questioning of the new industrial order and desires to reform it came from below long before the middle-class progressives took up the cause in the 20th century. In coal, workers made important suggestions about bringing order to the industry, and workmen and capitalists were able to cooperate for their mutual benefit, especially when the nation's economy was on the upswing. Mclaughlin's activities and beliefs indicate that traditional historical perceptions of the labor movement in the 1870s and 1880s need revision. As one historian has recently concluded, categories such as radical, conservative, or forward-looking, backward-looking are simply not useful in understanding the period, for these descriptions often all fit a person or a movement. Historians are also wrong to report that foreign-born labor leaders were hardly influenced by post-war American radicalism. Mclaughlin, for example, was an important member of miners' unions on both sides of the Atlantic, and he served as a top national officer of both the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. His friends and acquaintances included such diverse individuals as John Siney, Andrew Cameron, Richard Travelick, James B. Weaver, Michael Davitt, and Samuel Gompers. And he was active in greenback labor politics as well as Irish nationalism. Like the supposedly backward-looking reformers, he believed in arbitration, currency expansion, the cooperative movement, and anti-monopolism. And he hoped that workers could regain some of their independence from the capitalistic system. But like the forward-looking trade unionists, he fought for immediate economic and legislative gains within the capitalistic system, and he strove to improve the welfare of the industry that he worked in for 6 decades. In Mclaughlin's life, the drive for personal success was strong. He was one of many who defended the worker, but tried to escape the burden of work. Last, Mclaughlin's life shows that historians need to reassess their ideas about the amount of information that workers left behind. Although not voluminous, it is ample in many cases. The labor press, local newspapers, and county histories contain a wealth of information on labor that deserves closer scrutiny. If properly conducted, future studies will show that railroad union leader, and socialist Eugene V. Debs was at least partially wrong when he wrote, "The labor agitator of the early days held no office, had no title, drew no salary, saw no footlights, heard no applause, never saw his name in print, and fills an unknown grave." At least these things are not true of the subject of this study, for he was, in fact, a Nestor of the miners' union. Any questions or comments?
Area was the source of much inter-union rivalry between the two groups.
Yeah, like I say, I have some more to look into on this, and I did not find all that much where he was. I don't know what it was. I could not find what triggered his desire to change. He had been a knight of labor and apparently satisfied with that, attended their conventions, and then all of a sudden, somehow I think there was some correspondence between him and McBride.